welcome back, grade 10s. We have our final essay tomorrow, and it is worth 9% of the year. No pressure. It is an essay that you have had some exposure to in the past. The first half of the essay is the same as the last essay we wrote. It reads, globalization built on the natural cornerstone, that the strong do what they want and the weak suffer what they must, provides a mirror into the exploitive nature of mankind. So this part of the essay you're ready for. This part of the essay you've analyzed. But if you write that essay again tomorrow, you will get 40% at best. Because that's not the whole essay anymore. There's a second half, right? So there's a second half that we still have to analyze, and there's a second half that we have to respond to. So the next two sentences need to be analyzed in your intro as well as what you've done in the past. And you need to create a thesis statement that not only responds to that first sentence, but now responds to the last two sentences as well. So you definitely have an old essay that you can use as a starting point, but you need to add to it. You even need to add to stuff in the intro because the source that you're analyzing has changed. So somewhere in your source, you need to wrestle with what does it mean in the spirit of competition? So in the spirit of competition, man changed. When they say in the spirit of competition, they're talking about, this is where I thought people would be taking notes. They're talking about the zero-sum theory, right? They're talking about the zero-sum game. They're talking about imperialism. They're talking about the competition between the British and the French, between the Spanish and the Portuguese. They're talking about the carving of the world. So when they say in the spirit of competition, that's an implicit, not explicit, but implicit reference. We can imply, we can infer that they're talking about the age of imperialism. We can imply that they're talking about the zero-sum theory, the zero-sum game, where the British believed that in order to defeat the French, they needed to gain at the expense of the French. And the British also were competing against, at times, the Germans. The Spanish and the Portuguese were in competition with each other. So when it says in the spirit of competition, we can definitely unpack that phrase. Because that's what the analysis of the source is. Unpacking the phrase and then saying, what does this mean? So we need to unpack that language. In the spirit of competition, it's a reference to the zero-sum game. It's a reference to the age of imperialism. It's a reference to the Portuguese and the Spanish agreeing to carve the world, and the British and French fighting over North America. In the spirit of competition, man changed the old and new worlds. So you're going to have to demonstrate that you understand that the old world is Europe, and the new world, for the most part, was the Americas. And when it says change the old and new worlds, we're talking about the Columbian Exchange. So we're talking about the Columbian Exchange where some products, some goods, some commodities went west to east and some went east to west. So products that went from the new world back to the old world included things like the tomato that Europe hadn't had before. But products that went the other way included things like wheat. So in order to unpack this source, where it says change the old and new worlds, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes intentionally, often brutally, you need to go back to the Columbian Exchange and say, here's an example of an inadvertent changing. This is where something was introduced inadvertently. But they didn't mean to introduce it, but it was introduced by accident. Maybe it's European rats that have stowed away on board a ship. And once the European ship comes to dock at the bay in the New World, some of the rats scurry into America, and now European rats are in America. Maybe it's the inadvertent changing of these native ecosystems here by introducing flora and fauna that was not native to the Americas. And as a result, we end up changing the ecosystem. So much like today when American bullfrogs are introduced in places like Australia and then suddenly become a predator for some of the indigenous animals there, and now some animals in Australia are endangered. Examples like that. So sometimes intentionally, this is when they say, you know what, it's not by accident, we purposely left those pigs there. Because we knew we were going to come by this island again, and we wanted to eat pig next time we came by the island. So we dropped off, a few pigs, we come back, and now there's dozens of pigs, because pigs breed. Now we got lots to eat. So in Captain Cook's explorations of the Pacific, often they left pigs behind. Many were left in areas like Hawaii, and when you go to Hawaii, it's become a part of the culture, a pig roast. But those pigs were not native to the islands. They were introduced by explorers wanting to have something to eat when they came back. That's an intentional changing. So you could do some research and say, what's an example of explorers intentionally leaving something behind, like pigs, so that they can benefit from it maybe on their return voyage home. Often brutally. So this is where you need to establish that through the Columbian Exchange, they introduced something that had brutal consequences. Brutal consequences on the ecosystem. So maybe it drives something into extinction. Maybe it creates a competition as you've introduced a new apex predator. So there's room within that sentence for you to science it up a little bit. I know that science is many of your first love, and here's an opportunity to shine with your knowledge of science. And you might be sitting there saying, oh, I'm not sure I have enough science. We have lots of time today for you to get some science. So in order to unpack that sentence, you need to be able to talk about the Columbian Exchange. You need to give evidence, give examples of inadvertent, intentional, and brutal introduction of foreign flora and fauna that change ecosystems. Next sentence says, only in the spirit of cooperation can man preserve the fragile remains. So the purpose of the last two sentences is, in competition, we mess things up. In cooperation, we may be able to save it. That's the purpose of those last two sentences. So in your essay, it's going to be important for you to wrestle with which direction is more sustainable or which direction is more desirable for the future of mankind. Will we unlock our potential through competition or cooperation? And it's 100% acceptable for you to pick competition. I don't want you to think that in order to do well on this essay tomorrow, you have to sacrifice your principles. If you really believe that it is competition in an Adam Smith, invisible hand, laissez-faire kind of way that unlocks our true potential, then argue that. And I think that you can even look at some future casting, some hypothetical evidence, looking at what will 2050 look like, and say that the future will be more desirable if we continue to unleash our creative potential through competition. SpaceX competing against NASA, competing against the Chinese and the Russians to get to Mars. That's how we get to Mars. It's not through cooperation. The International Space Station has been a mission of cooperation for decades. That mission is stagnated, right? So maybe cooperation stagnates. Maybe we need competition. So you can go in multiple directions. But in the end, your essay needs to deal with lots of big rocks. In the end, your essay needs to, your thesis needs to respond to, is it natural for the strong to feed on the weak? Somewhere in your body, I need to read a response to that. Is it natural? You've analyzed what it means in the intro. You've talked about the ideological perspective presented here, but in your body, I need to see your response to that. Is it natural for the strong to feed on the weak? And in order to defend your arguments, you can use theoretical, hypothetical, historical, contemporary, or even personal evidence to explore that concept. Is it natural for the strong to compete on the weak? So today will be an opportunity for you to add to your evidence as well. Then the next big rock that this essay is built on is it true that globalization gives us this mirror into our human nature? And if it does give us a mirror into our human nature, is it true that we are exploitive? It's kind of like a twofold rock, right? A rock that has like a little bump coming off of it. So this rock says globalization gives us a mirror. We can look into it and say, oh man, that's what mankind looks like. And then the rock is saying that, not Dwayne The Rock Johnson, but the rock of the essay is saying that our nature is exploitive. So you could take an argument that maybe our nature is more than exploitive. Maybe we have the potential to be exploitive, but we have the potential to be other things too. Or you could argue that, yeah, you know what, we are exploitive. That's what defines us. Then that next sentence we talked about, in the spirit of competition, man changed the old worlds, the old and new world, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes intentionally, often brutally. It's hard to argue against that. You know, it's hard to say, no, you're wrong, right? That's basically a statement of fact. So you can explore what that looks like, but the thing that you can take a position on is, to what extent is it true that cooperation is how we preserve what remains? Because this is a statement against competition towards cooperation. And again, I would argue that maybe you have an opportunity to argue the opposite. One last key thing that you're going to need to unpack in the analysis and talk about in your body as well. It does say, only in the spirit of cooperation can man preserve the fragile remains. If I do Control F and I have nowhere in your essay does the word fragile come up, or fragility, or anything like that, your essay is incomplete. I need you to explore, what does that mean, fragile remains? I need you to explore the last two related issues. The ideas of sustainable development, the ideas of death of birth, you know, potentially the age of stupid that we live in. Metaphorically, you could look at, you know, the bedtime story analogy. You could look at the idea that we're all in a room and the walls are closing in analogy. You can again turn to science and talk about climate change and climate chaos and animal extinction. You need to talk about, to what extent is the world fragile? And given that it's fragile, or given that it's not, how should we respond? And that's your essay. So tomorrow, instead of getting the regular 90-minute class, you guys have an advantage. You have the whole morning, right? 8:30, you could come in, get started if you needed to. And we're here till 12:25. So you have lots of time tomorrow, but the time's gonna go by, and then you'll be like, Mr. McBride, can I hand this in late? And I'll be like, it's the final exam, it's due now. Don't hand it in, you're gonna take a 0. You need to have a plan tomorrow. You need to say, in the first half an hour, I'm gonna accomplish this. In the next half an hour, this is what I'm gonna do. You need to have a plan. So after today's planning session, you need to have a schedule for yourself for tomorrow, so that it's not 11:15 and you're still working on the intro. If that's the case, you're not gonna really finish. The intro is worth 30%, the intro is worth 6 of 30 marks, right? So the body is the majority of the paper. So you need to be able to get the intro down quickly so that you can focus on your thesis statement and evidence and argumentation to defend it. There's lots to do in that analysis though. So I would say it's to your advantage to write it today and to commit a lot of it to memory as well. Any questions before we jump in? So the quote is on Google Classroom. I'll put it on again. I'll just copy and paste it and put it on again for today if you don't like going back to the 26th and finding it. But this is what we're working on. I encourage you to work with others. So if you're doing research on the Columbian Exchange, and you're like, man, this is a lot of research, why not say, why don't you look for the inadvertent part, and I'll look for the intentional part, and you look for the brutal part. At the same time though, 9% is the essay tomorrow, and unlike the A1, there's no mulligan on this one. So we do need to focus on it. Any questions? I'm gonna be here all class. If you need help, put up your hand and I can come up. Anybody at home, if they need help, they can just send me an email during the day. I'm probably not gonna be looking at my email tonight at 10 o'clock.